2005, spring 2005. One of the founding members of the committee, Fuller Cow, is sitting back with his lovely wife. He was a protege of C.W. Snedden, and he was the publisher of the Newsminer for 40 years or more, 4 decades for sure, and saw this town grow, had quite a bit to do with the way that it developed up here. It's his wife, though, who, together with Charles Mason, our current chair of the Communication and Journalism Department, as we've been rebranded as COJO, who first talked to Ms. Snedden about endowing a chair in journalism in honor of her husband. And that has resulted in just a tremendous set of top journalists from around the country, and at least one international one, that have spent as much as a year, but often just 2-3 days or a week in the department. And for a small department, that has really, in the course of 4 years, exposed our students to an amazing set of expertise, and it's been an amazing sort of program that continues to return a lot. Tonight we also have the Dean of CLA here, which we thank you. And I understand Alaska's biggest new media mogul slipped in the back, Ryan Binkley, and then I recognize many familiar faces.
Oh God, I got to cut all the parts about the Daily News now. Shit.
Yeah. But tonight we're here to hear from a Minnesota kid that was pretty much oriented on science and
yeah, I was trained as a scientist, for better or for worse.
Who had a hankering to come see Alaska, and came up here in the early 70s at a time when the department had a bunch of characters that are really well known still, Jimmy Bedford, but also an individual, John Ullman, who went on to found or be the first director of investigative reporters and editors. And if there's a common theme in the journalists that have taken part in this program, I think at least 9 of them had some affiliation with IRE, investigative reporters and editors. And Craig has referred to him as somewhat of a mentor who really showed him how to dig deep into stories.
Yes, and took a lot of my money in poker games. Is that even legal for a professor?
Yeah, well, as you can see, he's hard to sort of control in terms of once he has a microphone, let alone once he has access to a keyboard and ink. And I will mention that he has worked his way around all Alaska newsrooms, from KTABF to ADN in its heyday, to
Juneau Empire for 7 years.
Juneau
Yeah,
Empire, one of the founding voices in Alaska Dispatch, and today is moved into the digital site, Craig Medred News.
which is pretty simple to remember.
Yeah, and with that, I will leave you to Craig to tell us about honesty.
Oh Lordy, this audience is too big for a guy who doesn't like to give speeches. And Brian told me to save some time at the end for questions and answer. I hope I do. It's interesting to be back here at the University of Alaska, sitting on this side instead on the other side, which is the only experience I've had here before. 45 years ago, I reached the end of the Alaska Highway, a know-it-all 21-year-old fresh out of the University of Minnesota School of Journalism, as in kicked out, but we'll get back to that. All these years later, I know less than I did then. The one thing a life in journalism should teach anyone with half a brain is how little journalists know. We are the people who watch the play. We know a fraction of what is known by those in the cast or by the crew behind the curtain. Journalism was a lot different in 1973 than it is today, but strangely enough, much the same. The national press was hounding a flawed president named Richard Nixon. The national press is today hounding a flawed president named Donald Trump. Nixon had committed crimes while in office, the worst being an illegal war, invading Cambodia without bothering to inform the U.S. Congress. But he wasn't in as much trouble for that as for overseeing a 2-bit burglary of the offices of the Democrat Party, his political opponent. As everyone knows or should know, the offices were in the Watergate complex, and the scandal that followed came to be called Watergate. We as journalists have been forever since cursed with this gate and that gate. The New Republic in February actually published a story headlined, "A Third Way to Think About Russiagate." Russiagate would of course be a reference to the sitting president who is being haunted by what he might or might not have done prior to his election. Whether a sitting president can be impeached for actions committed before he became president is an intriguing question which I will avoid despite any personal love of wrestling with intriguing questions, and my personal belief that doing so is one of journalists' greatest responsibilities. Journalism ideally helps further intelligent debate in a country founded on the idea that free and open debate is vital to the survival of a democracy. We have, of course, cycled through a lot of different views of what constitutes free and open. President Thomas Jefferson had one view, Senator Joe McCarthy had a distinctly different view. We are thankfully closer to Jefferson's time than to McCarthy's time, though equally thankfully, we haven't gone all the way back to the 1700s and the start of the 1800s, when newspapers made Twitter look almost tame. One of the John Adams supporting newspapers in the presidential election of 1800 called Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw sired by a Virginia mulatto father." I apologize to anyone in color in the audience, as well as to those of mixed breeds of God only knows what like myself. The 1800s were a different time. Journalism changed a lot over the course of 200 years, only slide back a bit. The accusations leveled at Jefferson in 1800, unfortunately, aren't all that much different from what I've seen a retired Alaska journalist direct at Alaska Dan Sullivan on Twitter. The journalist seems clueless as to how much such vitriol coming from someone who long professed a belief in objectivity reflects on those of us who still profess a belief in objectivity. And don't get me wrong, I don't think journalists are objective. As humans, we are never going to achieve that goal. We are hostages to our life experience. At best, we're aware of our own biases, which makes it easier to weigh and correct them in the reporting process. Claiming objectivity instead of admitting prejudice and promising to do our best to be fair might be one of the greatest failings of journalism in my lifetime. There was a time when we put ourselves up on a pedestal. It was inevitable that we'd get knocked off. As everyone in this room surely knows, faith in the American media is an all-time low. The country doesn't much respect what we do. Most people think we're inaccurate, unfair, shallow, and sometimes just plain ignorant. There's a little truth to all those accusations, and more to others, especially the latter. The world has gotten smarter in the 21st century, and journalism really hasn't kept up. From the outside looking in, journalists can look pretty stupid. We make a lot of mistakes. The little mistakes, the unforced errors, as one might say in tennis, might do more damage than the big mistakes. When I talk to readers, I hear more complaints about this than anything. A lot of them notice words misspelled, bad grammar, and simple unawareness of facts. A lot of this can be blamed on the economics of the situation and the elimination of quality control in the name of cost. When I started my journalism career, a reporter wrote a story, sent it to a city editor. The city editor read it and sent it to a copy editor. It was just a typo in the speech right there. That was perfect timing. The copy editor read it and sent it to production, where more than one person often read it, what was getting pasted up to be printed. All of those people looked for mistakes, as a matter of course. More than once, I had people in production come and tell me something needed to be fixed. Now at CraigMedred.news, I'm one person operation doing all those things. And it's not all that much different anywhere else. The bright spot is that there are a few people online who, in the big cloud, help me out by finding and correcting errors, but there aren't enough of them. Now I lost my place. Most places a story gets looked at by another set of eyes before it in some way is published, whether online in their paper, and that's about it. When I was last at the Anchorage Daily News, some of the old copy editors were in a funk because they'd been told to stop proofreading stories. There was no time for it. They were told, read enough to write a headline, write the headline, and move the story. Errors are destined to creep in when the system works like this. And errors don't help improve the national view of journalism. The mistakes leave a simple question lingering in a reader's mind. If they can't get the simple things right, how can I expect them to get the big things right? The internet, where most news now lives, only serves to magnify the answer. My favorite anecdote involves a newspaper story about a man who fell down a wellhead, was asphyxiated, and taken to the hospital. I read the story online and was still trying to get my head around how someone could get in an 8-inch or 10-inch pipe in order to fall down a wellhead when I noticed readers had already begun to comment on the asphyxiation. Asphyxiated, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, means you died from lack of oxygen. Dead people aren't taken to the hospital. As I watched, the comments below the story turned into a pretty serious critique. It was not a pretty critique. It basically concluded the reporter writing the story was clueless. I happen to know the reporter when this was later pointed out. The excuse was the fire department said that. That excuse that was what someone else said is now a common defense offered by reporters who make unforced errors. And it's a perfectly fine excuse for a stenographer. It's not a perfectly fine excuse for a journalist because journalism is not stenography any more than Facebook is journalism. The product that news organizations sell, and let's make no mistake about this, journalists are engaged in the sale of a product. Promises a certain degree of credibility. The product is produced, or is professed to be produced, by professionals. This professionalism is really the only thing that makes journalists different from old Joe sitting on stool 7 at the Triangle Bar pontificating on who knows what. So let's get back for a minute to where journalism was when I arrived in Alaska. Back in those Washington Post Watergate days, the paper was run by a legendary, now dead editor named Ben Bradley, who didn't have much tolerance for mistakes, and who once wrote these words: "As long as a journalist tells the truth in consequence and in fairness, it is not his job to worry about consequences." Let us forgive Bradley for the use of the masculine pronoun his. He lived in a different time. Newsrooms were still heavily male-dominated, though that was changing. But he offered a pretty good standard for what journalists are supposed to do, even if the truth can be hard to define. Fairness is easier. Most reporters know what is fair. Most reporters can accurately apply that standard even to people they don't like. If they have time to contemplate it, if they have the space to provide contextual information, if they have the desire, and if they don't get played. It's sadly easy to get played, especially these days when reporters don't actually do much boots on the ground reporting. They don't have time for it. The unrelenting demands of a 24/7 internet monster that must be fed keeps them chained to desk, processing what they are delivered by a small army of publicists, many of them in government, who hand out the news. It's easy to get played. As the columnist H.L. Mencken once observed, there is always a well-known solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. I personally plead guilty to falling victim to the neat and plausible, time or two or more or 10. It happens. Journalism is a difficult business. It's a little like intelligence gathering. You collect as much information as you can, and then you try to figure out what is accurate and what is not, and how the pieces fit together. Sometimes reporters don't have enough information. Often they don't have enough information. Often people lie in various ways. They leave out important details. They offer conclusions based on assumptions rather than admitting they don't know things. And sometimes they just make stories up. Those here should be well aware of this problem in the wake of the release of the Fairbanks 4. Brian O'Donohue and the students who worked with him, where's Brian? Worked with him on the stories of those young Fairbanks men are to be commended for the work that eventually got them out of jail. But it's hard to overlook that journalists played along with the narrative that sent them there. Once the narrative is established, it's unfortunately easy for journalists to play along, even if the narrative contains obvious flaws. Journalism would be much better served if more journalists paid attention to the words of the late General George S. Patton. If everyone is thinking alike, someone isn't thinking. But it can be uncomfortable to be out there questioning everything. It's easier to go with the flow. It's more comfortable to be part of the club. And thus, it's way too easy for journalists to get caught up in groupthink, especially if their information originates from people they see as good guys sources. The police and crime stories are generally presumed to be good guys, despite a long history of police errors and abuses in this country, and it is a long one. Environmentalists are always thought to be good guys because saving the planet is a good thing. It doesn't mean that environmentalists always behave well. I can remember early in my career being played by the balance of nature. There is none. Nature is a seesaw bouncing around in a world of chaos. The balance of nature is, however, a wonderful idea. It is neat and it is clean, and one of the flaws of humans is that we want neat and clean explanations for everything. Our desire for order might be one of our greatest intellectual weaknesses. Ideological partisans understand this well. They sell a simple world governed by black and white rules that define the good guys and the bad guys. On a national level, some journalists have bought into this same partisanship, and unfortunately, what happens on the national level has influences everywhere. Some want to blame Fox News for starting this. It made a decision to go right because it saw a business opportunity in a market it thought was leaning too far left. Its business success would indicate it made a good marketing move. And who can fault Fox for what it said it wanted to do? Fair and balanced? We report, you decide. Isn't the latter what all news consumers want? Do you get that thought often? Do I need to even ask that question? News stories these days provide enough information for a reader to make any informed decision. Some stories, who know how many, shade the information to dictate a conclusion. Journalists aren't above personal prejudices, and they are in many cases unleashed from the rules that governed straight news only a decade or two back. For anyone who's curious as to what the prejudice is, there's an attorney in Denver named Vanessa Otero who runs this website called All Generalizations Are False. That's allgeneralizationsarefalse.com. She has put together a very interesting chart of media bases. She's not a journalist, but she has some rational standards for determining bias and lays them out in great detail on her website. She also offers a simple chart for major publications. Reuters and AP, though they make a lot of mistakes, anchor the center of her fact reporting box. Washington Post and the New York Times skew slightly liberal. The Wall Street Journal, slightly conservative. The Guardian anchor the right center and left center in her complex analysis box. Daily Beast and the Weekly Standard move further to the left and right. There are significantly more publications left of center than right of center. Everything goes farther left and farther right as the chart drops down into the unfair persuasion category and the propaganda boxes. Breitbart and InfoWars lead the propaganda publications on the right, with Occupy Democrats and the Palmer Report on the left. If you're like me, You probably know someone who reads one of those latter websites and thinks they are the truth in a world where the truth is a moving target. I hope everyone in here knows someone like that, because conformity is boring. Not to mention bad for democracy. Democracy thrives on differing ideas. The problem is it needs people to talk to each other for the differences to be useful. The mainstream media once helped further such discussions. Today there are a lot of people in this country who see the mainstream media as little more than an arm of the ruling elite. I'm going to quote here. To most people, a reporter is less a local job held by a real person than a TV talking head or an unknown elite, writing copy from faraway Washington or New York. Mark Oppenheimer wrote in the Los Angeles Times in attempting to explain why so many, especially among conservatives and independents, have come to hold the media in such low regard. Quote, only when we know our reporters again will we begin to trust them, he added. So how many people in this room know a reporter? Don't count me, don't count Brian. How many people in this room have called, texted, or emailed a reporter to compliment them on a story, explain something they got wrong, or to suggest a story they should write? Oh, you don't count. You people who are in the business of doing that, don't raise your hands. The road here runs two ways. It isn't just about journalism influencing you. You can influence journalism. Journalism is still full of well-intentioned people. Yes, there are people who got in the business for the wrong reason. They want to be almost famous, and journalism, which used to be something of a blue-collar job, is one of the few highs of visibility professional jobs for which they can qualify. Thankfully, they're a minority, because that's not a good reason to get in journalism. Journalism is, or should be, the ultimate not about you job. Journalism is about other people and other people's ideas. It's about telling other people's stories and about encouraging others to think. It is, or was, about exposing society as a whole to the views of learned elders. There are some who wonder about the latter these days. General Mark Hamilton, the former president of this university, the other day expressed the fear that expertise is dead, killed by talking heads screaming opinions at each other on national TV every day. I'm not sure he's right, but the situation has been complicated by a strange media idea that fairness is as simple as finding two people to express polar opposite views. This is not always the case. Some judgment is needed. If you have cancer, for instance, the opinion of several oncologists matter than anything your favorite witch doctor might think. Newspapers were once pretty damn good at finding the learned voices, elevating them above the simply loudest voices, and writing stories that walked a tightrope between disagreement and divisiveness. Writing stories that left readers with differing, fact-based opinions on which they read and sent them off to argue among themselves. The need to recognize that and get back to it is vital, because this is really all news organizations have to sell. As Sam Gill, the Knight Foundation, has pointed out, most Americans might mistrust the media these days, but 73% believe misinformation, especially on the internet, is a significant national problem. And 58% say it has become difficult for them to sort out the true and important from the flood of information coming through the tubes. To quote Gill, if we can pull back and recognize that people across party lines value accurate information, that's a real opportunity. The big question then becomes this: can journalists in the business today still produce the material in a form that will get people to read it and meet that standard? And I'll tell you now what I told the Anchorage Daily News after Alaska Dispatch moved over there and before I got shit canned. The worst story anyone can write is one that nobody reads, because that story is a waste of everyone's time, energy, and money. That comment did not endear me to any of my old new colleagues who still thought journalism some sort of holy production, not a mere product. It's a product. Even religion is a product. Churches try to recruit new parishioners because if they don't, churches die. It's no different for news organizations. If they fail to attract readers, they can't survive. It's that simple. And just because a story is highly readable doesn't mean it has to be biased or badly reported, the latter being far, far, far worse than the former. Personally, the greatest compliments I can remember getting in all my years as a reporter and a columnist came from readers who called or wrote or texted or emailed to say, you know, I didn't agree with you on any of this, but we had a really good family debate over it around the dinner table. That a story, even a story that carries a point of view, contained enough facts for people to form differing opinions on what those facts mean is my personal definition of good journalism. The greatest weakness in day-to-day mainstream journalism I see these days is that there are few stories that meet that standard, and too many stories no one reads. The internet, in the latter regard, should have been a godsend to journalists. The internet measures what all of you read. If you're writing important stories, well, like important stories in journalism, if you're writing important stories and no one is reading them, you need to find a different way to write them. You need to find a better way to connect. You need to find a better way to reach people. The proprietors of fake news get that. That's the one thing they do get. The mainstream media needs to pay attention. And in some ways, we as journalists ought to be celebrating the current hullabaloo about fake news. The whole debate is really about the power of stories. Fake news scare underlines the importance of stories. Stories bring tribes together. Stories drive tribes apart. Stories can make us think or reinforce our prejudices. Stories can make the world better or worse. Stories have power. Leni Riefenstahl was one hell of a storyteller. She worked with a camera instead of a pen, but she was one hell of a storyteller. I'm guessing everyone in here knows who she was, but it's possible some of the younger generation don't. In 1935, Riefenstahl directed a movie titled Triumph of the Will, and it helped pave the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the creation of Nazi Germany. Riefenstahl called her work a documentary. The late film critic Roger Ebert once described Triumph of the Will as, quote, by general consent, one of the best documentaries ever made. He later revised his opinion and wrote this: the Triumph of the Will is a great propaganda film, there is no doubt, and various surveys have named it so. But I doubt that anyone not already a Nazi could be swayed by it. Being a Nazi to this film means being a mindless pawn in thrall to a god like Hitler. Were Ebert alive today, one could only wonder what his observations might be on fake news. A powerful propaganda tool, as some think, or merely a fodder for the mindless pawns in thrall. The man now occupying the White House now has some such followers who fit the mindless pawn category, but no president should bear criticism for having groupies. Bill Clinton had plenty of them, so too JFK, FDR, and others who rose to power as much or more on personal charisma than political policy. The more things change, the more they say the same. It is the nature of the world. I'm here in front of you reading words off a computer screen. Something unknown to journalists when I started my career in the typewriter age. As a young journalist, I thought I'd found heaven when electronic typewriters with self-correcting ribbons arrived on the scene, so you could actually back the machine up and fix a typing error. But what I was doing on a typewriter at that period of time, what I did after at various newspapers, what I'm doing now at craigmedred.news, sorry, you got to plug the product, is no different than what I was doing at the beginning of my journalism career and what others were doing before me on the very first typewriters, and before that with pen on paper, and before that ink on parchment, and before that probably hammer and chisel on stone tablets. As a species, we have been recording and telling stories since not all that long after we learned to speak. Stories are important to us. And for most of human existence, they were horribly partisan. We used them to unite our tribe against the enemy, and the enemy did the same. This journalism thing is really, really pretty new in the course of human history. The idea that people should be provided information and encouraged to talk out their differences rather than go to war, that idea was revolutionary. Not that the founding fathers were wholly successful in creating a utopian society. We had that little crisis called the Civil War about 150 years ago because we couldn't negotiate a settlement to our differences. We were tribal then, we remain tribal now. All that has really changed over the time is the size and shape of the tribes. At best in this country, we unite in working as one big tribe toward a common social goal. Sometimes we fracture into 1,000 tribes. Politically, at the moment, we're split into 3 tribes, 2 at each other's throat, and the big tribe not all that interested in the political gamesmanship. Where the journalism goes in all of this is hard to predict. Really hard to predict. It could dissolve into a gaggle of niche products, possibly pulled together in some sort of collective. Old media could grow its tent and throw it over a broader base of people wanting historically reliable source of news. Though the partisan debate sucks up a lot of the oxygen, most people aren't involved in the partisan debate. They still want news from an organization that offers them a broad range of perspectives. They recognize that when it comes to public and social policy, any question can have a lot of answers, with few of them being wholly right or wholly wrong. There was a time when journalism, when editors everywhere took it upon themselves to uphold a standard and ensured the sort of balance that could help people find those stories. Those editors weren't afraid to put their hand up and say, wait a minute, I don't think this is fair. If some of my old editors were alive to hear this coming from my lips, they might need CPR at this moment. I had what you might consider an adversarial relationship with editors. We argued a lot. I got in more than a little trouble with many of them after making a suggestion way back in 1987 that some of them didn't know what the hell they were doing. Probably didn't help that the comment was published in a book titled Best Newspaper Writing 1987. Personally, I'm not a big guy on looking back. As a reporter, I think history is vitally important because it often explains how we got to where we are in the moment. But personally, I'm a moving forward kind of guy. I care a lot more about what I can get done tomorrow than what I did yesterday, largely because I can't do anything about yesterday. But on this occasion, because I was going to give this speech, I did go back to see what's coming out of my big fat mouth in '87. And this was it. I really don't like people messing with my copy unless they can tell me why they're doing it. If somebody can tell me a better way to do it, I really am open to that kind of criticism. But with this, I don't like it, or this doesn't feel good stuff, I go ballistic. Editors in general tend to treat reporters like they don't know what they're doing. And I generally tend to give reporters credit that they do know what they're doing. If they don't, fire them. I mean, it's very difficult to find editors who are secure enough that they don't want to mess with things just for the sake of messing with things. Boy, did that internet change? Did the internet ever change that dynamic? We're now in a world where editors don't mess with enough things. The news now happens so fast that editors, of who there are fewer than ever, just don't have the time to mess with things. It isn't necessarily bad. But it is bad when they lack the time to say, wait a minute, this doesn't seem fair. Or simply, as the late Anchor's Daily News assistant editor Mark Salgado used to demand to know, what the F does this even mean? Only used a little stronger word. Salgado's ghost haunted the old Daily News building in Anchorage for years after his death. But journalism eventually got so sloppy it drove his ghost away. Old colleague Richard Murphy, he's up there somewhere, a former Snedden chair and a former Atwood chair at UAA, likes to tell me we lived through the golden age of journalism. He's older than I am. I like to tell him the fog of nostalgia sometimes makes things look better than they were. American journalism has a long history of getting caught up in the partisanship of American politics. And American politics have a history of upheaval. It's easy to think the country divided now, but we don't have the National Guard in the street shooting students as we did at the start of the 1970s. It's easy to forget how divisive those times and how caught in the middle journalism. There isn't that much between President Donald Trump today ranting about fake news and Vice President Spiro T. Agnew then ranting about the nattering nabobs of negativism. Well, except that Agnew got plenty of help from a good writer in the form of William Safire, who went on to become a renowned columnist for the New York Times. And Trump got a better delivery platform, a much better delivery platform. He clearly doesn't have Safire's ability to turn a phrase. With Twitter, he can sidestep the filter of the media and take his message directly to the American people anytime in real time. It's hard to underestimate how much that technology has changed things. Once politicians and the press needed each other, their relationship was somewhat symbiotic. Those days are gone. There is no need for cooperation on either side anymore, and everything is moving at a much, much faster pace. As a result, from Trump down, there's a lot more writing and a lot less thinking. Whether that proves good or bad, only time will tell. And I'll leave it right there. Questions?
Can you comment on Democracy Now? Have you listened to that program?
Yes, I used to listen to Democracy Now! All the time. As with many things, I didn't agree with a lot of it or found accuracy problems, but it was damn interesting. And they went some places that other programs didn't go. And that's healthy. I mean, that's very, very healthy.
Do you think that's biased?
Pardon?
Do you think they're biased?
Yeah, they're biased, and they admit they're biased. And I have less problem with people who admit they're biased and do it than with people who don't admit they're biased and do it. I mean, honesty is a virtue here. I mean, if you're coming from somewhere and you have an opinion, I don't have a problem with, you're doing just about anything as long as you make it clear what rules you're playing by. Where we get into trouble is with people who don't tell you what rules they're playing by and kind of present this, as if it were peer, as if there were some peer. But, I mean, and I sometimes think that may be where the media goes in the future. That we may go to a whole bunch of different sites with political views. My concern, my fear, I think the fear most American journalists have is that if you reach a point that happens, you don't get the crossbreeding, you don't get people talking to each other, you lose the community part that you have with an old style news organization that kind of puts everybody in the same room to have the discussion.
I've got a lot of concerns about Facebook being, people getting their news on Facebook, and the ability for anybody to get on there and spin something one way or another, make up an identity, put something out as news. The things that I read are that the fake news it actually goes viral way more than like the real stuff that was actually researched and has something behind it. And I have concerns in this country, but then I also read about where in other countries there's people killing each other because, you know, they get their news on Facebook. They say, oh, gee, these Rohingya people are like dogs, or, you know, just as an example. Any opinion on that? Any ideas?
I've thought about it a lot. Facebook is a problem where the solutions may be worse than the problem. You know, I kind of, at some level, this will sound strange coming from a journalist, I have great faith in the American public to sort that stuff out. You know, some of it gets out of hand. Sometimes people actually believe things that are so obviously ridiculous that you can't imagine it. But the only way I see to control it is government control. And the sort of government control is far scarier than the chaos that reigns there. So, you know, Mark Zuckerberg created a monster. What we're going to do with it, I don't know. I mean, you know, letters to the editor in newspapers are kind of gone in favor of Facebook comments. And I mean, I can remember when we used to check every letter to the editor. We'd like call people up and say, did you really write this? And, you know, there was an attempt to clean all this up and have a civil debate. And there have been a number of entities that have tried various logarithms to do that online, and nobody's found a way to keep the trolls out, to keep the misinformation out. On the other hand, I don't think there's anybody now who doesn't recognize that Facebook has a lot of misinformation. So, you know, it's kind of coming down to people having to sort it out.
I think in Europe, there's some laws being passed that try to, you know, rein in the Wild West kind of version of Facebook that we have here in the U.S. They're concerned about what happened with Brexit and some of the misinformation.
Well, they're trying, and I mean, the European media, if you find that European media, which has its own strange history, especially in England, but there's a lot of talk in Europe about, you know, selling credibility as the product. There's a bunch of, you know, news organizations there that now kind of talk about the fact that we vet stuff, the fact that we're credible, the fact that we try to do it this way is a marketable commodity. And hopefully, you know, we'll see that here someday. Yeah, I think the Anchor Daily News tries to do that. I think the Newsminer tries to do that to some extent. I mean, I think old media is a lot better than most of the new media in trying to do that.
Back in the mid-'80s, Stan Jones of the Newsminer did some investigative reporting that led to over some building contracts.
I remember well.
Yeah, and it led to the impeachment of the sitting governor. Is that kind of journalism, investigative journalism, happening anymore? Is it even possible?
It's possible. Boy. Yes, it's possible. I can think of several of those projects that need to be done. I mean, we have problems in this state. It's, I mean, there are some things in this state that really need to be looked into. It's just that those projects take time. They take some sort of organization. They take, you know, how many people saw the Post? They take somebody behind you with balls who's willing to, you know, go to the mat if somebody's going to threaten to sue or take legal action. Or, I mean, I know there's stories I sidestep because it's like, it's too dangerous. I mean, I don't have much money and I could lose it all because, I mean, this thing involves some people who might want to sue, and I'm hanging out there. So yeah, there's, I mean,
But do media outlets even have the staff anymore? Does the Anchor Daily
well,
have the staff to help them?
it depends on how you set up a newsroom, how you organize it. I mean, at Dispatch, when the old Dispatch, we were all pretty much required to do a couple stories a day. And then you kind of would take half the day to pursue whatever kind of projects you were doing, some that were short-term, some that were long-term. I mean, I did a long series on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council that is a really kind of semi-corrupt government organization, which ate up probably 3 months that I kind of did in between. But we also didn't operate in the real world. I mean, people there were working 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, most of them. And how we ever got, I mean, it was blatantly breaking the law. It was like, you know, I can't imagine any large news organization doing that without someone complaining and getting in trouble with the Department of Labor. But it was kind of an accepted thing there. I mean, it was a small bunch of people. It was, you know, committed to a cause. Tony Hopfinger used to joke about the big pink, if any of you are Bob Dylan fans. And they thought the model was, you know, a bunch of journalists form their own big pink and they all get a house together and hang out and do news. It's a little wacky, but, you know, there was some potential there. But investigative work just takes a lot of time. And it's dangerous. You can get sued, as Stan Jones can tell you.
Actually, I have two questions. One with along the lines of investigative journalism. I think the question also is it profitable? I mean, I hate to ask the question, but I think that's what...
No, that's a valid question. That's a very valid question. And I would turn it back and say I think it's profitable, but I'm not sure it's cost effective. If you follow me, I mean, you can make money off it, but you probably have to invest too much money for what you get. So it's got to be an adjunct to a bigger operation where, you know, you can live off the fat of the lamb while you generate products that give you market visibility. And there is market visibility in investigative journalism. It's just, it's like so much today. I mean, the bottom line, journalism is really a business. It used to be, you know, awash in money. I mean, I can remember when I won that American Society of Newspaper Editors Award back in '87. I invited Dave Barry, who was another award winner. I don't know if you know who Dave Barry was, a humor columnist, to Alaska to come speak at Press Club. And so while he was here, I decided to give him a little tour. So I just went and rented a helicopter and charged it to the Anchorage Daily News. And they paid for it. We spent a whole day in a helicopter having a great time, and they paid for it. And I'm sure now if someone did that, I think Ryan would probably shoot them. And it was, I mean, they had the money. I mean, they had lots of money. You could do that when you had lots of money. Now it's everybody's struggling to make a buck.
And the other question I had to do with the role of kind of like rumor management that you're seeing some newspapers. Rumor management. So like AP now runs the whole section, not the news. So they're using energy to basically debunk fake news stories, and kind of what role that needs to continue to play. And I know there's non-profits in like some third world countries, like the Sentinel Project, which basically deals with text messages to deal with rumor management to stop violence.
Yeah, which is a great marketing gig because you don't have to put much effort into diffusing a lot of those. Yeah, I mean, they're so simply, obviously made up that, yeah, it's a great, I mean, somebody was thinking when they came up with that idea, because you don't have to put much effort into debunking a lot of fake news. And if you've already got people trafficking looking for that, you're gonna pull a bunch of them to your debunk the fake news site, that's a great marketing idea. I know people kind of do it in depth. I hadn't seen the kind of, you know, smaller daily. It's a great idea.
I'll throw it out, Craig. So when I saw the media bias chart, I signed up for some feeds on Facebook of things on the other side of the site that I generally tend to be on. And I noticed now...
That would be just like you.
Yeah.
We went to school together.
Let's hear it for UAF Journalism Department. So now I find when those feeds come in, I'll start reading the story and I'll think, oh, that's them. we're a fragmented journalism source with all these different sources that have their own bias. We need to,
I think there's a need for diversity in newsrooms.
I don't think we'll see that at Fox.
I don't think we're seeing that anywhere. I mean, we used to talk about it at the Daily News, and it was like, let's get some colored people in here who think like we do. I mean, that's what it was. It was like, you know, and I used to say, let's get a born-again Christian in here. I mean, I'm far, far from those people. Anybody who knows me. I mean, I grew up in basically a religiously segregated town. I have real problems with religion. But, I mean, if you want a diversity of opinion, let's get some of those people in here. Let's get some people in here who really disagree with us. And I will tell you that the best journalism I ever did was in newsrooms where people disagreed. You know, the old Anchorage Daily News, there were regular arguments in the newsroom. I mean, there were people who threw shit on the floor, including computers a couple times. I mean, there was a lot of heated debate, and the heated debate made things better. Journalism has become very clubbish. It's a problem.
I wonder if it won't, journalism in general won't go the way of playing on and taking advantage of the prejudices of, if you go to, I can't think of the source right now, but you were saying if somebody admits their prejudice but yet tries to do a good job for their point of view, and then there's somebody else that who will use Republicans and Democrats for the sake of discussion, you can go read about something and you know you're getting a point of view, and then you can go to another side and get the other, and then you can do the comparison.
Yeah, and there's some of that going on now. I mean, the Midnight Sun does that. Suzanne Downham Must Read does that. I mean, the problem is that you don't get the cross-pollination. That you get people, they lock into like one site, and that's all they read, and that's. You follow me?
Yeah.
They get their own little group think, and this group gets a little group think, and it is, in my opinion, just not very healthy for democracy to have, you know, people. It just increases the partisanship when what we really need is people figuring out how to bridge the partisanship.
Yeah. So I wonder if that's not up to us. I guess my criticism, and I don't know if it's valid, but some of the mass media reporting is so shallow it's worthless.
Yeah,
and
well,
what do they do? Because
that's to go back to the Julie's question. I mean, my biggest problem is often not that it's partisan, it's that they don't give you enough information that you can actually form an opinion.
Right.
I mean, they tell you what they think, they don't give you the information. I once had a really good editor named Mike Campbell who said repeatedly, till I got sick and tired of it, don't tell, show. And they don't show. They don't go, here's the information, you figure it out. They tell. And then we get these websites that, you know, it's like 5 graphs of information. Why even do that in this age? I mean, it's just, there's not enough there to know anything. It only takes you 30 seconds to type up 5 graphs. I mean, it's the cheapest of clickbait.
So maybe that's what young people should be doing, is come out with something called dual news. And they talk to the national
Well,
news, print that out about Sean Hannity, and then you go to Fox News and print out what they say.
Yeah, I'm confident that some young people are going to figure this out.
Right.
I mean, information has value.
Yeah.
Some young people are going to figure this out. I'm some old fart. I'm not going to figure this out. I mean, I don't have the energy to figure this out.
You know the magazine The Week? They'll have a paragraph about something, and they will quote National Review and Washington Post and New York
Yeah.
Times. And it seems like they're trying to.
There are people trying to do that. There are sites trying to do that. It's just hard to do that. I mean, it's easy. It's a lot easier to get comfortable with a bunch of people you know and share your views than it is with a bunch of people whose views you don't share. And that's, I mean, we're kind of, I worry that we lose that. I worry that we lose the ability to sit down and community forum and talk to each other without people starting to scream and get, borderline violent and calling each other names. And certainly we're back to Facebook, and the deterioration of comments on Facebook is, I see formal journalists write some of the most vitriolic bullshit that I could ever imagine that offends me. I almost reported one of them to the FBI because he was borderline threatening someone's life. And I don't know how you do anything about that other than to talk about it and say it's not acceptable.
How do you feel about the role late night talk show hosts are playing in these days?
They have an amazing amount of influence, don't they? It's, is it news? Is it not news? Is it information?
Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's certainly a different thing. They didn't used to do that. They were pretty cautious about politics. I think it's a good thing in that some of it's funny. I think it may be a bad thing when people lose sight of the fact that it's humor and, it becomes part of the problem. We're a really divided, divisive country at the moment, and we have a guy in the White House who makes it a lot worse. There's just no two ways around that. So, it's going to go on like it goes on until it gets better. I would guess, the next election cycle we see someone talking about going back to George Bush and wanting to be a uniter, not a divider. I think there's ground there. I think people are worn out. I think you could probably run a campaign that gets you somewhere on that, and it may get better, or it may go on longer before it cycles. American politics is like this. We've often been at war with each other, and then we kind of make up, and hopefully we make up. The Civil War we didn't make up. It was ugly and bloody, but we usually kind of come back together. We go apart, we come back together. I kind of have faith in it. Not a lot of faith. The history of democracies is they don't last very long, but I kind of have faith. I think most people here believe in it.
So where do you get the news that you write about?
Well, some things I just follow. Some things I'd avoid, I'd get sucked back into because people grab me and say, you need to do a story about this. There's this long list of stories. People send me things that there should be a story about this. Some of those are stories I really don't want to do. One now involves a trooper incident that should have never happened. And I really don't want to write about the troopers doing bad stuff because it's just, I got enough problems on my plate already. I've been doing a lot of fishery stories as late because I think it's one of the economic problems facing the state that we do not begin to recognize where that's all going and what a mess it's going to be for us. I think the economy of the state's something I don't write enough about, and I should. I think our economic issues are big. I think the future here is very difficult. I wish I had more time to cover the oil industry. It's really not well covered now, and it's an amazing technological thing going on the North Slope. The technology there is space age. People here think you stick a hole, pipe in the ground and pump out oil. There's some really interesting stories to be done there. There's some probably really interesting stories tech-wise to be done in this building, and we probably need to be talking about those stories because, that's where the future is. This thing changed everything. And it's going to continue to change everything. And if the state is going to have a future, we probably need to figure out how to be part of that, because a lot of what we do to support our economy now isn't going to work.
I read the New York Times online, and one of the things that I think is good is that some of the, what I consider better newspapers, they'll write, and then there's blue ink that you can click on, and you can go find out where they.
Yes,
they wrote.
which you can't do too much of that. I link and link and link some more.
Okay, yeah, and
I mean, my philosophy is link like crazy. I mean, the internet has given you a gift from God in terms of being able to footnote everything.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'm sure it takes more time, and granted, they've got a bigger budget than any paper in Alaska, for sure. But one thing I have done in the past is I write a letter to the editor, and I'll put links in there, and they'll take the links out. And the reason that they take the links out is because they don't have the time or whatever, they don't want to research my link. They think, well, maybe there's going to be a virus or something in there. So what I don't write many letters to the editor, but when I do now, if I want to link something, I write the letter to the editor, and then I'm the first comment in there, and I say, here's the references to all the BS that I, wrote in my letter to the editor, so you can read this before you, send a hate mail.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to measure the quality of a story, I mean, that's one way to do it, is to look for the links. I mean, if you're reading stories that don't have a bunch of links to claims, to me, that links are a sign that someone did the work. Someone did the work, someone did the research, they're telling you where to go for more. This story probably has more merit than something, that goes on and on and on. There's no links in here. I mean, I love links.
I'll just say that in my mind, it's a good idea to support newspapers that you think are doing a good job at putting out, good, truthful information most of the time. So in other words, spend a little bit of your money. And for this,
hey, a good word doesn't hurt either.
Yeah, that too. But anyway, I'm concerned that as everything needs to be free now, right? Because we all want to pull our phone out and look stuff up for free and get all of our information for it's, sometimes when you pay for something, it's just, you don't want to lose that. I don't think.
Well, it's hard to get people to pay. I mean, especially young people, we grew up, they grew up in an age when you didn't pay for news. I mean, you just didn't pay for news. And they don't want to pay. And there's so many ways to beat paywalls that it's, something's going to change in the future. Somebody's going to figure out a way to monetize things. I mean, if I got a penny for everybody who clicks on my website, I'd be doing fine. And I mean, if there was some way to create some kind of online monetary system where, it just gave me a penny every time they clicked on a story, I'd be doing great. But there's not. Now maybe somebody will come up with some version of Bitcoin that, and there's a penny, and then everything will change. So, I mean, I kind of love technology. I think it's going to help us, not hurt us in the end, but at the moment it's really painful for journalists. Roberta, what are you laughing about?
It's Christmas.
Yeah, I'm blaming Christmas. She was all the problem at the Newsminer at one time.
Yeah, we were talking about the story that you posted that told people how to get around the paywall at the Newsminer.
Don't complain about your pennies you don't get. Oh, 80 in.
Thank you very kindly. I use that as an illustration of why paywalls don't work. I somehow never invite your friends to a lecture.
So you said you're a storyteller, but you didn't finish the story about leaving.
That was to see if anyone was paying attention, and you won the award. It says a little bit about me, and it says a little bit about journalism at the time. I took a class for which I did not have prerequisites. I was doing fine in the class. Then it was discovered I didn't have prerequisites. They threw me out. And that was when I was done with it. So I came to Anchorage. This story gets better. I came to Fairbanks. I got here. In '73, there was no work. I mean, I ate a lot of grayling. I ate a lot of snowshoe hares. I can't look at a snowshoe hare anymore. I mean, I almost puke when I look at a snowshoe hare now. So I finally decided I had to go back to school because I could get a student loan to go to school, and at least I could stay alive. So I went back to school and I registered for some journalism classes, and I was doing it, and the teacher, the people taking the, your class forms, registration forms, said, well, you know, you can't take that class unless you have the instructor's signature. And I said, okay. I took the form, I went across the room, I signed the guy's name, took the form back. First day in class, John Ullman calls me aside and says, do you remember me? And I said, no, should I? And he said, you forged my name. And that's where our relationship began.
He wrote investigative.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of, I never did very good with rules. I don't know why.
A good segue. So Craig, you lost your job at the Anchorage Daily News, and you might have actually lost it a few years later when you were...
It was still the Alaska Dispatch News there. I don't want that falling on poor Ryan over here.
Because of your integrity, so you lost your health care, you lost your income. Was it worth it?
Doing the right thing is always worth it. I mean, it's always worth it. Would I do it any differently? No. I mean, the guy, it was a, you know, a state official breaking the law. I'm just not going to turn my back on it. So yeah, I'd do the same thing. What happens, happens. Yeah. He was posing as an Alaskan and he was living in Montana. There's a guy on the fish board who was, you know, claiming to be a resident in Montana, has a house down there, big house, a nice house where his wife lives, which she claims, oh, she needs to live there with her for her health. If you went on Facebook, she's like dancing with the granddaughters. It's like she's the healthiest looking woman I've ever seen.
What did that have to do with you being fired?
Pardon? Well, I know who got me fired, but I'm not going to say. Because it's political, but Alice Rogoff didn't like it. I'd been told not to pursue the story. I pursued it anyway because I don't like rules. And the shit hit the fan. And, you know, we negotiated a settlement. She paid me some money, so it was, you know, fair enough way to leave, and I left. And I'd, you know, do the same thing again. You just do the right thing.
So you were told not to do an investigative report.
I was told to let that story go, and I said, there's something stinks here. And I got on the computer one night, and I pulled up the Montana Fish and Game. You can get a license online like here. And I typed in Roland Maw, and it asked me for my driver's license, which I couldn't go any farther, but I knew some people in Montana law enforcement. And I said, you know, he's in the system as if he's a resident. Can you check that for me? They checked that for me. They said, yeah, he appears to be a resident. So I went and called a trooper I knew. We went to coffee. I said, here's what I know. I want double confirmation on this. And by the next morning, Roland Maw was resigning the Board of Fisheries and beating it out of town. So it was, you know, would I do it again? Yeah, I'd do it again. You shouldn't do that kind of stuff if you're on a public board.
Did you get to write about this?
Did I?
Spelling it all out.
Do we really want to go there? I will tell you what happened, and I'm not going to name names. On the morning that Maud resigned, I woke up, I found the notice that Maud resigned, I found an email from the trooper saying you were right. I went into the office, I told people in charge exactly what had happened, and they decided to write a story about how Roland Maw had withdrawn over Cook Inlet Fish Wars. So my leaving was probably a good thing on several levels, because we weren't going to work too well together after that. It is what it is. I mean, it's a very imperfect business. You know, Alice had some motivations for that. The commercial fishing industry in the state has a lot of political pull. Is what it is.
How often does that sort of thing happen?
Not very often. I mean, it's not very often reporters get fired. I mean, it's all, I don't know that anybody, I don't know that any other reporter has ever caught a state official committing felonies.
How often were you told not to do the story?
There were probably stories in my early daily news years I was told not to do, but I did them anyway, and there was never any repercussion. At dispatch.com, I could, there was nothing they were going to, well, I take that back. There was a story killed at dispatch.com. It involved Terry Smith, the pilot for Ted Stevens. Terry Smith, if you don't know it, had a stroke. In a lot of countries, if you've had a stroke, they won't even let you get your driver's license back. They're very strict about that. I went deep down the stroke hole. I learned a lot about strokes. We were ready to write a story. Alice called me to her house, and Terry Smith's wife was Terry. Alice and Terry were best friends. Alice gave me a long sob story about, Terry, this is killing Terry, all the news about Terry, do we have to write another story about her husband and the stroke? I mean, it was very complicated because he had the stroke during intercourse. So she had real baggage. I mean, she kind of thought she was responsible, and Alice gave me the sob story, and we spiked that story. But she didn't tell us. I mean, she asked at that point. We all believed she abided by contracts. And Tony basically had a contract saying, I run this operation, and if you fire me, or if I leave on my own, you pay me a lot of money. And we didn't know then that contracts meant nothing. I mean, he kind of ended up at the Daily News finding out how they meant nothing. But at that time, we just kind of, if she said do something we disagreed, we just went and did what we wanted to do. And in that case, she asked very nicely, and I rolled over.
Now that you're on your own, how often do you find yourself telling stories?
More than I'd like to. I mean, it's you're really exposed when you're in a business by yourself. There's a million stories out there. There's stories I should do about things I know that I'm not going to do because the downside is just I can't afford to fight it. If somebody makes a really big stink about it, I just can't afford to fight it. It is what it is.
You mentioned earlier in the Jeffersonian era that newspapers were again very fragmented, and yet somehow we grew out of that era, at least for a while. What either about the country or journalism allowed or caused that change to happen?
Damn, that's a good question. I don't know. I would guess part of it was that we're still engaged in the westward expansion, so people who couldn't get along just moved to find a new place. I mean, we weren't as intertied as we were. I mean, people, were more rural. They could form little communities here and little communities here, so the like-minded didn't have as many clashes with others. I'm sure the Civil War tempered us a lot. I mean, there were a lot of people got killed. It really changed the country, and I'm sure, that and what followed in the rebuilding of the South had a lot to do with, people kind of understanding we need to get along. I mean, I'm sure for a long time after that there was an understanding we need to get along. This was horrible. But no, I don't know, and I think it's easier to figure out how we get pushed apart than it is how we get pulled together. The Depression pulled us together for certain. World War II pulled us together. World War I pulled us together. It's sad to say, but wars kind of unite people. So it's democracies are really fragile things. I mean, if you go back in history, they don't survive long.
In regards to the term freedom of the press, in your opinion, where are we at there? Are we completely free, somewhat free?
we're pretty damn free at the moment. I mean, we're probably as free as we've ever been. And that's the scary part when you start talking about Facebook and how you control things. And it's just, you know, we went through the McCarthy years. We know what it's like when government starts trying to rein things in. It can get really nasty and ugly. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things wrong with where we are. It's better than the alternative. Kind of like democracy. It's a mess, but it's better than the alternative.
There's been a lot of talk about Facebook lately, especially because it's been in the news so much, but what do you think about Twitter or other social media sites? Are they any better about spreading, sharing news?
You know, I don't use Twitter as much as people tell me I should. I'm not a big Twitter fan. I think there are certain things that it is a convenient way to cover as a journalist. But a lot of Twitter to me is Donald Trump. And it isn't very productive. There's a god-awful lot of name-calling on Twitter. I mean, in general, Twitter, Facebook, there's just a lot of name-calling in this country. I mean, it's just, you know, it's childish. You're an asshole. No, you're an asshole. No, you're an asshole. You're an asshole. It's just childish. And I don't know how you break the cycle of that. And, you know, I don't blame Twitter. I just hope Twitter would kind of grow up, or the people using Twitter would grow up.
We were talking about things that change, and the internet has really changed the cost of entry to become a publisher. I mean, you don't have to own a TV station, you don't have to own a
Yeah, anybody can be a publisher now. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's really cheap and easy.
Is there anything that scares you about how easily a person can launch a whole newsroom?
No, because I think the markets kind of sort things out. I mean, I think markets will. I mean, I give markets more credit than most people do for getting rid of a lot of the trash. I mean, websites come and go so fast that it's amazing how fast they come and go. It's amazing how fast celebrity passes. I don't know if you remember the earthquake guy. I wrote about the earthquake guy on Kodiak Island, who, you know, had the camera going at night and had, you know, thousands of people running to his website. Well, it worked for one event, and then he kind of tried to do that because a bunch of people told him to do that, and he found out how hard it was, and it went away. Producing news is time consuming to produce. I mean, I try to produce a story a day, and it means I'm always at a computer and always being told, you need to get up and take a walk. It's just really time consuming. It requires, you know, a lot more thought than you think it does. It requires a lot more effort than you think it does. You know, it's a cerebral process. It's not easy. As I like to tell people, flying an airplane has checklists. I mean, you can go down the checklist and, you know, it's pretty easy. There's a formula there. Once you know how to fly, it's safe because you got a checklist. There are no checklists for journalism. I mean, if there was that, you know, my daughter and her soon-to-be husband would probably be doing the AI formula to do it, and they'd have somebody doing this for me. But it's not as easy as it looks.
Well, the checklist that used to exist in a form was just the number of sources you have to restore. You wanted enough sources to know that
Yeah,
it's true.
and I mean, I start with an advantage. I've been here for forever. So, you know, a lot of what I write about, I know almost to an expert level. And that just makes it a lot easier. I know I've done a lot of research, you know, being trained as a scientist makes that really easy. I mean, the internet is a wonderful damn thing. I mean, you can look up peer-reviewed studies just everywhere. I mean, there's a ton of good information on the internet. And that all helps. But yeah, it's a time-consuming, grinding business.
Would you talk about the difference between financial journalism and the relationship between the two?
Well, I think done right, they're kind of similar. Done right, they're both pretty fact-based operations that you depend on a lot of information. I think with science, it's easier to prove things. I mean, journalism, you often, science, you can define what information you need to get to prove a hypothesis. In journalism, you sometimes can't get the information you need. You can define what you're trying to find, but you can't get the information. But no, I thank God, and I have my whole life, that basically my training was as a scientist. I mean, it affects how you look at the world. I wish every journalist got that training. And not the soft sciences, probably the hard sciences, because it's just way too easy to, believe things because you want to believe them. And there's a lot of that in this country now. I mean, it's the Donald Trump version of the world. It's true because I believe it. Well, in science, you learn there are ways you prove things are true. And that's really valuable to a journalist.
So which form of the black arts of science were you trained in?
I kind of went through them all. I actually, at the University of Minnesota Duluth, they had a very good embryology department. And if the country at that time hadn't been so constrained by laws as to what kind of research you could do in embryology, I probably would have kept up a scientific career and gone there. I mean, it was just an intriguing, there were at that time so many unknowns. I mean, people were talking about test tube babies, they were talking about genetic manipulation in vitro, but I mean, there was so much unknown that it was intriguing, because every question was, we don't know. I mean, you'd ask a question, it was, we don't know. And so I would have done that, but there was it was like you could see that it was going to be a long time. And there's a reason the first test tube baby was born in England, because you couldn't legally do that here. So you could kind of go, this is just going to be frustrating. So then I was for a while a fisheries major, and then I was for a while a wildlife major, and I was into a lot of ecology classes, a lot of biology classes. Journalism was kind of journalism was, my quant quality lab was a disaster. I had a lot of trouble with quant. I really struggled with it. My lab mate was having similar problems. He was in line to get a Rhodes Scholarship and thought he wasn't going to get the grade he needed, and talked about breaking into the professor's office to get the final exam, which I think he may have done because he got an A on the final. I wasn't quite up to that bit of rebellion. I passed the class, but it was kind of the end of, I got to find, I was breaking up with a girlfriend. It was just all chaos. It was like the year I left for Alaska. I mean, I drove home from Minnesota. It was the opening day of fishing season. I was going to visit my mom. It was bumper to bumper for 100 miles. People were driving down the grass median trying to push to pass, and I just got home and I said, I'm moving to Alaska, and my mother had a heart attack. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm moving to Alaska. And school finished up, and I loaded up my Opel station wagon and hit the Alaska highway. And when I first got on the gravel, it was raining like crazy, and there were trucks everywhere upside down in the ditch, and campers ripped off, and I kind of went, what am I doing here? And it just kind of turned into a grand adventure.
So is there a way for free that we can get on the subscription thing so that when your daily story gets posted, we get it?
Yeah, but I don't know how you do it. I know a lot of people do it because I get all these email pings that, it says so-and-so's now following your blog. So there's some way you can do it, but I don't know, because my daughter does she kind of did all the layout and the design and made the site work. So I'll ask her and I will email you. But yeah, it's pretty embarrassing, isn't it? That's the kind of businessman I am, Julie. Bad, really bad.
I want to public